The music stopped the moment Charlotte screamed. She had not meant to scream. The sound had come out of her before she could stop it, torn loose the instant she saw the empty velvet case sitting open on the dressing table, the sapphire necklace gone, and 3 pairs of eyes turning toward her, as though she had done it herself. The ballroom below had been filled with laughter only minutes earlier. Now the laughter had stopped too, replaced by a silence that pressed against her ears like water. Guests crowded the doorway of the private chamber, craning their necks to see what had happened, and at the front of them stood Lord Hensley, the magistrate, his face set in the grim satisfaction of a man who believed he already understood everything. Edmund reached her first. He pushed past 2 footmen and a startled maid to take her by the shoulders, and for one brief moment, Charlotte let herself believe that everything would be explained away, that this was some foolish misunderstanding that would dissolve by morning like frost under sunlight. Then she saw the torn piece of blue silk caught on the latch of the window, the exact shade of her gown, and she understood that nothing about this night would be simple. "Was in this case, not 20 minutes ago," said Hensley, stepping into the room without waiting to be invited. "I saw it myself when Lady Ashworth wore it to greet her guests. Now it is gone. The window is open, and a piece of the Duchess's dress is caught on the latch. That does not mean she took it," Edmund said, his voice low and controlled, though Charlotte could feel the tension running through his hands where they still held her shoulders. "No," Hensley agreed. "It does not, but it does mean she must answer for it. A servant saw her enter this room alone not long before the theft was discovered. The evidence is circumstantial, Your Grace, but it is evidence all the same, and I cannot simply overlook it because she is your wife." Charlotte felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet. She had entered this chamber, yes. She remembered it clearly. She had come to retrieve her fan, left behind after she changed for dinner, and she had left again within moments, the necklace still gleaming in its case, exactly as it did now, except that now the case was empty. "I did not touch it," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I have no reason to steal from my own household." "And yet here we are," Hensley said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man used to being believed. "I am willing to grant you until dawn, Your Grace, out of respect for your husband's position and the guests who do not wish to see a scandal break out mid-celebration. But if the necklace is not recovered, and the true thief not named, by the time the sun rises, I will have no choice but to bring formal charges against the Duchess." A murmur rippled through the gathered guests at the door. Someone whispered the word thief, low enough to seem accidental, loud enough to be heard. Charlotte kept her chin lifted, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, had begun to tremble. Edmund turned to face the crowd, and something in his expression made the whispering stop. "Leave us," he said, and though his voice was quiet, no one in that room mistook it for a request. The guests filtered out slowly, reluctantly, casting glances back over their shoulders as they went, until only Hensley remained by the door, arms folded, watching. "One night," Edmund said to him. "You will have your answer by dawn." Hensley inclined his head and stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him, and for the first time since the scream had left her throat, Charlotte was alone with her husband. She expected him to ask if she had done it. She braced herself for the question, rehearsing in her mind how she would answer, how she would make him believe her even though the evidence sat coiled around them like a snake. But he did not ask. He walked instead to the window, examined the torn silk caught on the latch, and turned it over in his fingers as though it might tell him something the eye alone could not see. "This was cut," he said finally, "not torn. Look at the edge." Charlotte crossed the room to stand beside him, grateful for something to focus on besides the dread pooling in her stomach. He was right. The fabric had a clean line along one side, too straight to be the work of an accidental snag. "Someone wanted it to look as though I had caught my dress here," she said slowly, the realization settling over her like cold water. "Someone who had access to your gown," Edmund said, "or a piece of it." They looked at each other, and for the first time in the 8 months since their hurried, arranged marriage, Charlotte saw something other than polite distance in her husband's eyes. She saw the beginning of an alliance. "You believe me," she said, and she had not meant it as a question, but it came out as one anyway, as though she still could not quite trust the evidence of her own senses. "I believe the fabric," Edmund said, "and I believe you would not be foolish enough to steal a necklace and leave your own dress behind as a signature." It was not quite the declaration of faith she had hoped for, but it was enough to loosen something tight in her chest. The estate outside their door continued its noise faintly, muffled laughter and the distant scrape of a violin being retuned, but inside the chamber, the two of them stood surrounded by silence and the wreckage of an evening gone wrong. Charlotte thought of the guests already speculating, already deciding her guilt before the sun had even begun its slow climb toward morning, and a cold, clear anger rose up beneath her fear. Who else knew the necklace would be in this room tonight? She asked. Edmund considered the question carefully. My mother's jewels are always brought out for the winter ball. Everyone in the household would know that. The question is, who knew it would be left unattended, even for a few minutes? I only left it because Grady told me you wished to speak with me in the East Hall, Charlotte said, remembering suddenly. I set the necklace down to change my slippers, and by the time I reached the East Hall, you were not there. Edmund's expression sharpened. I never sent for you tonight. Not through Grady. Not through anyone. The words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward with implications neither of them wanted to name aloud. Someone had deliberately drawn her away from the room. Someone had known exactly when the necklace would be unguarded, and for how long. Then someone lied to bring me here, and lied again to send me away, Charlotte said. This was planned. By someone inside this house, Edmund said grimly. Who wanted you blamed specifically? Not simply a thief looking for jewels, but someone who wanted your name attached to the crime. Charlotte felt the fear in her chest shift into something colder and more useful. If someone had built this trap so carefully, they had also, perhaps without meaning to, left threads behind. Threads that could be pulled. Then we have until dawn to find them, she said, and I do not intend to spend that time waiting quietly in this room for Lord Hensley to decide my fate. A soft knock interrupted them before Edmund could answer. Grady, the very footman Charlotte had named only moments before, stood in the doorway with his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had gone pale. Your Grace, he said, bowing low, first to Edmund and then, more hesitantly, to Charlotte. I heard what happened. I never sent word to the Duchess tonight. I have been in the kitchen since supper helping with the wine service. I never left the lower floor. Charlotte studied him carefully. She had known Grady for the better part of a year, and had trusted his steady presence without truly examining it. Now she searched his face for deception and found none, only the plain fear of a servant who understood how easily suspicion could fall on someone with no title to protect him. Then who delivered the message in your name? Edmund asked. I could not say, Your Grace. But if someone wished to use my name without my knowledge, they would need to know I am often sent to carry messages between the two of you. That is not a secret kept from many. Most of the household staff would know it, and perhaps some of the guests as well, if they have visited often enough to notice the pattern of things. It was a small detail, but Charlotte felt its weight settle into place, beside the cut silk and the empty case. Whoever had orchestrated tonight's events did not simply understand the layout of the house. They understood the rhythms of the people who lived within it, the small, unremarkable habits that made a lie believable. Thank you, Grady, Edmund said. Say nothing of this conversation to anyone until morning. Of course, Your Grace. The footman bowed again and slipped from the room as quietly as he had entered, leaving the door to swing softly shut behind him. Charlotte exhaled slowly, only now realizing how tightly she had been holding her breath since Grady's knock. He was telling the truth, she said. I believe so, Edmund agreed, which narrows the circle of who could have known enough to imitate him convincingly, but it does not close it. Half this house has walked these halls long enough to learn its habits. He moved to the small writing desk near the window, drew out a sheet of paper, and began to note down names, quick and economical strokes of ink that Charlotte watched over his shoulder. Family members present that evening, guests who had visited the estate before, familiar enough with its staff to know their duties, servants who might have been paid, or frightened, or persuaded to lie. The list was longer than Charlotte would have liked, but shorter than she had feared. And at the top of it, underlined without comment, sat the name of Edmund's cousin, Gerald, a man who had arrived uninvited that afternoon, claiming urgent business that no one had quite understood, and who stood, by law and by blood, only one signature away from inheriting everything Edmund possessed, should the marriage produce no living heir, and something unfortunate befall the Duke himself. Charlotte had never liked Gerald, though she had never been able to name precisely why. He smiled too readily, the sort of warmth that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. She had dismissed the feeling as simple unfamiliarity. Now, looking at his name at the top of Edmund's list, she wondered if her instincts had been trying to tell her something all along. You suspect him, she said quietly. I suspect everyone, Edmund replied, though his eyes lingered a moment longer on Gerald's name than any other. But I intend to be certain before I accuse anyone of anything. An accusation without proof is exactly what has been done to you tonight, and I will not repeat that mistake against another, even one I have reason to distrust. Edmund studied her for a long moment. and something like respect flickered across his face, unfamiliar in its warmth. "No," he agreed. "I do not suppose you do." Outside, the clock in the hall had already begun its long count toward morning, each chime a reminder of how little time remained. Somewhere beyond these walls, among the guests still murmuring over spiced wine and stolen glances, the true thief moved freely, believing the frame had already closed around an innocent woman. Charlotte intended to prove them wrong before the sun rose. She smoothed the front of her gown, the very garment that had been used to accuse her, and looked at her husband with a steadiness she had not felt since the scream first tore its way out of her throat. "Where do we begin?" she asked. Edmund glanced once more at the cut silk in his hand, then toward the door where Hensley's shadow had only just retreated down the corridor. "With whoever told you I wished to see you tonight," he said. "Because whoever gave you that message knew exactly where you would be, and exactly when you would leave this room unguarded. That is not the work of a stranger. That is the work of someone who lives among us." The words hung heavy in the quiet chamber, and beyond the closed door the ball continued as though nothing at all had happened, violins rising into another slow waltz while somewhere in the crowd, a guilty guest smiled and reached for another glass of wine, certain that the Duchess would take the blame long before anyone thought to look elsewhere. Gerald Ashworth stood by the fireplace in the drawing room, a glass of brandy warming in his hand, and smiled at Edmund as though nothing in the world had gone wrong that night. "A necklace has gone missing, and half the household is in an uproar," he said, swirling the amber liquid slowly. "I heard the Duchess was seen leaving the room just before it happened. Terrible business, truly terrible." Edmund watched his cousin closely, searching for anything false in his expression, any flicker that did not match the concern he wore so easily on his face. Gerald had always been skilled at wearing whatever expression suited the moment. It was, Edmund thought, one of the reasons he had never fully trusted him, even as a boy. "You arrived rather suddenly this afternoon," Edmund said, keeping his tone light. "I do not recall receiving word that you intended to visit." "Business matters," Gerald said smoothly. "Nothing that concerns tonight's unpleasantness. I only came to speak with you about the northern properties, though I confess the timing now looks rather unfortunate, given what has happened." "Rather unfortunate indeed," Edmund said. He left the drawing room without pressing further, unwilling to show his hand before he had gathered enough proof to be certain of it. Gerald's calm was either the calm of an innocent man, or the calm of someone who had planned every detail carefully enough to expect scrutiny and prepare for it. Edmund could not yet tell which. He found Charlotte in the library, bent over a stack of old household ledgers she had pulled from the shelves, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you looking for?" he asked, closing the door behind him. "Anything that might tell me who has been in this house recently, and why," she said, not looking up. "Servants keep records of deliveries, of visitors, of small errands. If someone planned this carefully enough to imitate Grady's message, they may have left some other trace behind them, something ordinary enough that no one thought to hide it." Edmund sat across from her and began sorting through a second stack. For a while, neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft rustle of pages and the distant muffled music still drifting from the ballroom below, as though the world outside this room had not yet learned that anything was wrong. "You do not trust him," Charlotte said eventually, without looking up from the ledger in her hands. "Gerald?" Edmund said. It was not a question. "You have been thinking of him since the moment you wrote his name on that list." Edmund set down the ledger he had been examining and rubbed at his eyes, suddenly aware of how tired he felt, though the night was far from over. "My father and his father were brothers," he said. "Gerald has always believed the estate should have passed differently, that some old disagreement between our fathers cheated him of what he considers his rightful inheritance. He has never said as much outright, but I have heard it in the way he speaks of the property, always as though it is temporarily out of his hands rather than never his to begin with. And if you and I have no children," Charlotte said quietly, "the title and everything with it would pass to him. Eventually, yes." The word hung between them, heavier than either of them wanted to acknowledge. Their marriage had been arranged 8 months earlier, a practical joining of two families with more history than affection, and though they had settled into a careful, polite companionship since then, neither had spoken openly of children, of heirs, of the quiet pressure that surrounded every noble marriage from its very first day. "If Gerald orchestrated tonight," Charlotte said slowly, "he did not simply want the necklace. Jewels can be sold, but they are a small prize next to an entire estate. He wanted me removed, disgraced. 743. Perhaps imprisoned, or at the very least sent away in shame, leaving you without a wife and without an heir, and leaving the path to the title clearer for whoever came after you. should something happen to you as well. Edmund had not allowed himself to follow that thought to its full, dark conclusion, but hearing Charlotte say it aloud made the shape of it undeniable. If Gerald was willing to frame an innocent woman for theft, what else might he be willing to arrange, given enough time and enough opportunity? "We need more than suspicion," he said. "Hensley will not accept a family grudge as proof. We need to know how the necklace left this house, or where it is hidden if it never did." Charlotte closed the ledger in her lap and sat back, thinking. The window in the chamber was open. Everyone assumed the thief left that way, out into the gardens. But it is a considerable drop from that window, too far to climb easily without notice, especially during a ball with guests wandering the grounds for fresh air. "Unless the thief did not go out the window at all," Edmund said slowly, following the thread of her thought. "Unless the open window was meant to suggest an escape that never happened. Then the necklace may still be somewhere inside this house," Charlotte said, sitting up straighter, energy returning to her voice for the first time since the accusation had been made. "Hidden, waiting to be recovered once suspicion has settled comfortably on someone else." Before they could leave the library, the door opened and Margaret Finch, Charlotte's lady's maid, slipped inside, her face pale beneath the soft candlelight, her hands twisting nervously in the folds of her apron. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Charlotte first, then glancing anxiously at Edmund. "I did not know whether to come to you tonight, but I could not stay silent any longer." "What is it, Margaret?" Charlotte asked, rising from her chair. "Earlier this evening, before the ball began, I was asked to press one of your gowns for a small tear along the hem. I did not think much of it at the time. Small tears happen often enough with fine silk. But when I heard what was found caught on that window latch, I began to wonder whether the piece matched the tear I mended, or whether it came from somewhere else entirely." Charlotte's pulse quickened. "Who asked you to mend it?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as though she feared being overheard. "I was told the request came from you, Your Grace, delivered through one of the upstairs maids. I never questioned it. Such requests are common enough that I did not think to ask further." "I gave no such instruction," Charlotte said slowly. "I feared as much," Margaret whispered. "After I finished the mending, I set the gown aside in the servants' hall, meaning to return it to your chambers before dinner. When I went back for it not an hour later, a small piece had already been cut away, near enough to the hem that I did not notice until I held the fabric up to the light. I assumed at first that I had simply misjudged my own work. Now I do not think that is true at all." Edmund's expression had grown darker with every word. "Who else was in the servants' hall during that time?" "Many people passed through at that hour, Your Grace, with the ball preparations underway. I could not say for certain who might have had a moment alone with the gown, but I do remember Mr. Gerald's valet asking after you, Your Grace," she said, looking at Charlotte again, "wanting to know which chamber held your evening things, so that a message might be delivered properly. I thought nothing of it at the time." "Servants ask such questions constantly when a house is full of guests." Charlotte exchanged a look with Edmund, the pieces settling into place with a clarity that felt almost too clean, too convenient and yet undeniable all the same. A valet with a reason to know exactly where her gown would be. A cut piece of silk, a false message meant to draw her away from the chamber at precisely the right moment. "Thank you, Margaret," Edmund said. "You have done the right thing coming to us. Say nothing of this to anyone else tonight, not even to the other staff. Your safety may depend on it." Margaret's eyes widened slightly at the warning, but she nodded and slipped from the room as quietly as she had entered, leaving Charlotte and Edmund alone once more amid the towering shelves of ledgers and old family records. "He used his own valet," Charlotte said quietly, once the door had closed. "He did not even trouble himself to hide his methods particularly well. Perhaps he believed no one would think to question a servant's simple errand. Or perhaps he believed the accusation against you would move so quickly that no one would have time to question anything at all," Edmund said. "Hensley did not come to that ballroom by accident tonight, Charlotte. Someone summoned him early, before the theft was even discovered publicly. I intend to find out who." The realization settled over Charlotte like a fresh weight, heavier even than the fear she had carried since the necklace case was first found empty. This had not been a hurried, desperate act of opportunity. It had been planned across many small moments, arranged with a patience that unsettled her far more than sudden violence might have. Whoever stood behind it had time, resources, and access enough to move pieces into place across an entire evening without raising suspicion, until the final moment when everything collapsed onto her at once. "We should go to the chamber again," Charlotte said. "There may be more we missed the first time, now that we know to look more carefully." They rose together, the ledgers forgotten, and made their way back toward the private wing of the house, moving quickly and quietly past the few remaining guests who lingered in the corridors, murmuring behind gloved hands as the Duke and Duchess passed. Charlotte kept her chin lifted, refusing to let their whispers slow her pace, though she felt every glance like a small, cold touch against her skin. The chamber where the necklace had been kept was dark now, the case still sitting open and empty on the dressing table, exactly as it had been left. Edmund lit a lamp while Charlotte moved to the window, running her fingers along the frame, testing the latch, searching for anything that might explain how the cut silk had come to be caught there. "Look," she said after a moment, holding the lamp closer to the wall beside the window. A section of the paneling did not sit quite flush with the rest, a hairline gap visible only when the light struck it at the right angle. Edmund crossed the room and pressed his palm against the panel. It gave slightly beneath his hand, swinging inward with a soft, reluctant creak to reveal a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a single person, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of the lamplight. "A servant's passage," Edmund said, staring into it, "built generations ago, for moving between floors without being seen by guests." "I had nearly forgotten it existed." "Someone else remembered," Charlotte said quietly. They stood together at the threshold of the hidden passage, the lamp casting long shadows across the walls, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, both aware of what this discovery meant. Whoever had taken the necklace had not needed to escape through a window at all. They had simply needed to know this house better than anyone else believed they did, well enough to disappear into its bones and reappear somewhere entirely unexpected. "Where does it lead?" Charlotte asked. "Toward the east wing," Edmund said, his jaw tightening. "Where the guest chambers are kept. Where Gerald is staying tonight." Charlotte felt something settle inside her, cold and certain. "Then that is where we go next." Edmund hesitated only a moment before stepping into the passage, holding the lamp ahead of them both, and Charlotte followed close behind, her earlier fear giving way to something sharper and more determined. The dust of decades stirred beneath their footsteps, and somewhere ahead in the darkness, she thought she heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a door easing shut. "Someone else is in here," she whispered. Edmund raised the lamp higher, its light trembling slightly against the narrow walls, and quickened his pace toward the sound, Charlotte matching him step for step, both of them moving now with the shared urgency of two people who understood, at last, that the answers they needed were close enough to reach before the night ran out. The passage narrowed further as it went, forcing them nearly single file, the air growing colder and thinner the deeper they walked. Charlotte kept one hand against the wall to steady herself, the rough stone scraping faintly beneath her palm, and tried not to think too closely about how long it had been since anyone had walked this way before them. Cobwebs brushed her shoulder, and somewhere far above, she could hear the faint vibration of the ballroom orchestra still playing, as though the house itself had two separate lives, one bright and public, the other hidden and full of secrets. "There," Edmund murmured, stopping so suddenly that Charlotte nearly collided with his back. Ahead, a thin seam of candlelight traced the outline of another hidden door, and beneath it, unmistakably, the soft shuffle of movement. Charlotte held her breath as Edmund reached for the panel, and for one suspended moment, the entire night seemed to balance on the edge of whatever lay behind that door, waiting to be discovered. She thought, in that brief stretch of silence, of every polite dinner she had shared with Gerald since her marriage, every compliment he had offered, every smile she had returned without ever suspecting the calculation working quietly behind it. She thought of the sapphire necklace itself, a family piece meant to be worn with pride, now turned into a weapon against her. And she thought of Dawn, drawing steadily closer with every passing minute, carrying with it either her vindication or her ruin. Edmund's fingers closed around the edge of the panel. He glanced back at her once, a silent question in his eyes, asking without words whether she was prepared for whatever truth waited on the other side. Charlotte answered with a small, firm nod, and together they pushed the door open into the candlelit room beyond. Before they found the sitting room, Charlotte had insisted on one more pass through the dressing chamber itself, retracing her own steps from earlier in the evening as carefully as she could remember them. She stood exactly where she had stood when she first entered to fetch her fan, closed her eyes, and let the memory unfold slowly, the way one might reread a familiar page searching for a line missed the first time through. She had entered, crossed to the small table by the window, retrieved her fan from where she had left it that afternoon, and turned to leave again within moments. The necklace had still been resting in its case, she was certain of that, the candlelight catching faintly on the sapphires as she passed. She had seen no one else in the room, heard nothing unusual. The only sound had been the distant music from the ballroom below, and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her own slippers. It was that detail, small and easily overlooked, that caught her attention now. The floorboards had creaked, yes, but they had creaked twice, not once. A second faint sound following just behind her own footsteps as she left the room, as though someone else had shifted their weight nearby, careful to remain out of sight. Someone was already here, she said aloud, opening her eyes to find Edmund watching her closely. Watching, waiting for me to leave. I heard it and dismissed it as the house settling, but it was not the house at all. Could you tell where the sound came from? Edmund asked. Charlotte considered carefully, picturing the room again in her mind. Near the window. Perhaps behind the curtain, or closer to the wall than I realized. It was this thought, more than anything else, that had led them to examine the paneling near the window so closely, running careful fingers along every seam until the hidden passage revealed itself. But before that discovery, while Edmund had still been questioning the household staff one by one in the corridor outside, Charlotte had slipped down to the edge of the ballroom itself, wanting to see with her own eyes who among the guests still lingered, and who had already begun to distance themselves from the gathering entirely. Most of the guests remained clustered near the refreshment tables, exchanging hushed speculation about the theft in tones that carried just far enough for Charlotte to hear fragments as she passed. She kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to let their whispers show on her face, though each one landed like a small, unwelcome touch against her pride. It was near the terrace doors that she noticed him, a guest she did not immediately recognize, standing slightly apart from the others, his attention fixed not on the gossip circulating the room but on Charlotte herself, watching her with an intensity that made her step falter slightly. When their eyes met, he offered a shallow bow and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes before turning away toward the terrace, disappearing into the cooler air outside. She found Edmund a short while later and described the man carefully, the cut of his coat, the particular way he had watched her, the unfamiliarity of his face among guests she otherwise recognized from years of similar gatherings. Henry Colton, Edmund said, his expression darkening slightly at the name. He was not on the guest list. I do not know who brought him, or why. You know him. He courted you once, did he not, before our families arranged the marriage between us? I recall hearing something of it, though it was never spoken of directly in my presence. Charlotte felt heat rise briefly to her cheeks, an old, uncomfortable memory stirring beneath the more pressing fears of the present night. Briefly, before my father decided the match would not suit our family's interests. Henry took the rejection poorly, though I had thought that particular wound long since healed on both sides. I have not spoken to him in over a year, and yet he arrived tonight, uninvited, and has spent the evening watching you rather than enjoying the festivities, Edmund said. That is not the behavior of a man who has moved on entirely from old disappointments. Charlotte turned the thought over carefully, uncertain what to make of it. She did not believe Henry capable of orchestrating something as elaborate as tonight's theft. Not truly, though the old hurt in him might have made him susceptible to being used by someone with a clearer, colder purpose in mind. If Gerald had needed a distraction, someone to draw attention away from his own movements through the house, a jilted suitor nursing old resentment might have served the purpose without ever fully understanding what role he played. We should watch him as closely as we watched Gerald, Charlotte said. Even if he is not the architect of tonight's events, he may be a piece moved by someone else's hand, whether he realizes it or not. It was with that thought lingering between them that they returned to the dressing chamber, and it was there, running careful fingers along the paneling near the window in search of whatever might explain the second creaking floorboard Charlotte remembered, that they finally discovered the hidden seam in the wall. The room behind the hidden door was not Gerald's chamber at all, but a small, disused sitting room, its furniture draped in dust cloths, its single window shuttered against the night. A candle burned low on a side table, its flame flickering as though someone had only just left it there, and beside the candle sat a folded scrap of paper. Charlotte reached it first, unfolding the note with careful fingers while Edmund held the lamp closer. The handwriting was unfamiliar, quick and slanted, as though written in haste. Keep her occupied until the case is found empty. Do not be seen. There was no signature, no name to attach the words to a face, but Charlotte felt a chill settle over her regardless. Someone had written these instructions, folded them, and carried them into this hidden room, only to abandon them moments before Edmund and Charlotte arrived. Whoever left this heard us coming, Edmund said, moving quickly to the small door on the far side of the room, the one leading back into the ordinary corridors of the east wing. He pressed his ear against it, listening, but heard nothing beyond the faint, steady hum of the house settling into the later hours of the night. "We are close," Charlotte said, folding the note carefully and tucking it into the bodice of her gown. "Closer than they expected us to be." Edmund nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Close enough that they will grow careless, or close enough that they will grow desperate. I am not certain which worries me more." They left the sitting room through the ordinary door, emerging into a corridor lined with guest chambers, most dark and silent at this hour, their occupants either asleep or still lingering over the last of the evening's wine downstairs. Gerald's door stood at the far end, a thin line of lamplight visible beneath it. "We cannot simply accuse him without proof," Edmund said, lowering his voice as they approached. "If we are wrong, or if he has hidden the necklace well enough that we cannot find it tonight, an open accusation will only give him time to prepare his defense before Hensley." "Then we need him to believe he is not yet suspected," Charlotte said, an idea beginning to take shape in her mind. "If he believes himself safe, he may grow careless with whatever remains hidden. But if he believes we are close, he will only grow more careful." Edmund considered this, then nodded slowly. "A trap of our own." They descended together, back toward the main house, where a handful of guests still remained despite the late hour, drawn by curiosity as much as any lingering enjoyment of the evening's festivities. Edmund found Hensley near the refreshment table, deep in conversation with two other gentlemen, and drew him aside with a quiet word. "I understand you wish to speak privately," Hensley said once they had moved to a quieter corner of the room, Charlotte standing close beside her husband. "We have made progress," Edmund said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man laying careful groundwork. "We believe the necklace has been found, hidden within the house rather than carried away through the window as first assumed. I intend to have it properly retrieved before dawn, along with proof of who placed it there." Hensley's eyebrows lifted with visible interest. "That is welcome news, Your Grace, if it proves true. I ask only that you keep this to yourself for now," Edmund continued. "I do not wish to alert the true culprit before we have gathered everything necessary to bring a proper charge." Hensley agreed, though Charlotte noticed the slight narrowing of his eyes, the careful calculation of a man who dealt often enough in half-truths and misdirection to recognize the shape of a plan, even when its details remained hidden from him. It did not matter. What mattered was that the words would travel, as such things always did in a house full of guests eager for fresh gossip, until they reached the one person Edmund and Charlotte hoped would hear them. Within the hour, the rumor had taken on a life of its own, whispered from one cluster of guests to another, growing slightly with each retelling until it was said that the necklace had already been recovered, that a name had already been attached to the crime, that the true thief would be exposed before the night's end. Charlotte watched from across the room as the words reached Gerald, who stood near the fireplace with a fresh glass of brandy in hand, his composed expression flickering, just for a moment, into something sharper and more anxious. He set the glass down without finishing it and made his way toward the corridor leading to the guest chambers, moving with the deliberate calm of a man trying very hard not to appear as though he were hurrying. "There," Charlotte murmured to Edmund, who had positioned himself nearby, watching the same scene unfold. "He is going to check whatever he hid." They followed at a careful distance, keeping to the shadows along the corridor walls, and watched as Gerald slipped into his chamber and shut the door firmly behind him. Through the narrow gap beneath the door, they could see the faint movement of candlelight, shifting as though someone inside were searching through drawers, or shifting furniture, or examining some hidden space they wished to confirm remained undisturbed. Minutes passed in tense silence before the door opened again, and Gerald stepped out, his expression once more arranged into careless calm, though Charlotte noticed the faint sheen of perspiration along his brow that had not been there before. He walked briskly back toward the main hall, and as he passed a narrow side corridor, he paused just long enough to press something small into the hand of a waiting figure, a young footman Charlotte did not recognize, before continuing on as though nothing at all had happened. "Follow the footman," Edmund whispered. "I will keep watch on Gerald." Charlotte nodded and moved quickly, careful to keep her steps light against the polished floor, trailing the young man as he made his way toward the servant's stair at the rear of the house. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, clearly nervous, clutching whatever Gerald had given him tightly against his chest. She caught up to him just as he reached the bottom of the stair, stepping out from the shadows to block his path. He startled badly, nearly dropping the small bundle he carried. "Your Grace," he stammered, recognizing her at once, his face draining of color. "I did not mean. That is, I was only asked to carry a message." "What message?" Charlotte asked, keeping her voice calm despite the urgency thrumming beneath her ribs. The young man hesitated, glancing toward the stairs behind him as though hoping someone might appear to rescue him from having to answer. When no one came, his shoulders sagged, and he held out the small bundle with trembling hands. "I was told to deliver this to the stables, Your Grace, and to have it carried away before morning. Given to no one but a rider waiting on the North Road. I did not ask what it was. I was paid well enough not to ask questions." Charlotte unwrapped the cloth carefully, and there, gleaming faintly in the dim light of the servant's stair, lay the sapphire necklace, exactly as she remembered it from the dressing table case, each stone catching what little light there was, and throwing it back in small, cold sparks. Relief and fury rose in her chest at once, tangled together so tightly she could not easily separate one from the other. She had spent the better part of the night fighting to prove her innocence against evidence deliberately planted to destroy her, and here, at last, was proof of the truth, small and simple and undeniable, resting in her own two hands. "Who paid you?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Mr. Gerald, Your Grace," the footman admitted, his voice barely above a whisper now, shame and fear mingling openly on his young face. "He told me it belonged to him rightfully, that there had been some confusion over the family jewels, and that it needed to leave the estate quietly before anyone thought to question its whereabouts. I did not know it had been reported stolen. I swear to you, I did not know." Charlotte believed him. He was young, likely new enough to the household that he had not yet learned to question the requests of a guest who spoke with such easy confidence and carried himself with such assumed authority. He had been used, just as Grady's name had been used, just as her own gown had been used, each small piece bent to serve a larger design without ever fully understanding its purpose. "You are not in trouble," she told him gently, though she watched relief flood his features with something like guilt of her own for having frightened him so thoroughly. "But you must come with me now, and you must tell the Duke exactly what you have told me." He nodded quickly, eager to cooperate, and followed her back up the stairs, the necklace held carefully within its cloth wrapping in Charlotte's hands. She found Edmund waiting near the top of the stair, his expression tightening with a mixture of relief and cold anger as he saw what she carried. "He tried to have it smuggled out through the stables," Charlotte explained quickly, relaying what the footman had told her while the young man stood beside her, nodding along in nervous confirmation of every detail. Given to a rider on the North Road before morning, Edmund's jaw tightened. Then he intended to remove the evidence entirely before Hensley could examine it, leaving nothing behind but the accusation against you, and no proof to disprove it. "But he acted too soon," Charlotte said. "The rumor we spread frightened him into moving before he had fully secured his plan. That mistake may be exactly what saves us." They stood together at the top of the servant's stair, the recovered necklace resting between them like proof of a truth that had finally begun to surface after a night spent buried beneath lies and careful misdirection. But Charlotte knew, even as relief washed over her, that recovering the necklace alone would not be enough. Gerald would deny everything, claim the footman had misunderstood him, insist the jewel had simply been misplaced, and that he had only meant to see it returned properly. Without something more, some undeniable proof connecting him directly to the false message, the cut silk, and the deliberate frame laid so carefully against her, his denial might yet be believed over her word. "We need him to confess," Edmund said quietly, echoing her own thoughts. "Or we need to find something in his chamber that leaves no room for denial." Charlotte looked toward the corridor leading back to the guest wing, where Gerald had disappeared only minutes earlier, and felt the last of her earlier fear harden into something far more resolute. She thought briefly of Henry Colton, still somewhere within the house, or perhaps already gone into the night, a loose thread she had not yet found time to follow. She thought of Margaret's trembling hands as she confessed what she had seen, and of the young footman still standing quietly nearby, awaiting instruction, his fear slowly giving way to something like relief, now that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Every piece of the night had led here, to this corridor, to this choice. "Then let us go find it," she said, "before dawn takes the choice away from us entirely." Edmund nodded once, handed the recovered necklace to a trusted steward for safekeeping, and together they turned toward the guest wing, toward whatever proof still waited to be uncovered before the sun rose and decided, one way or another, how this night would be remembered. Gerald's chamber door was locked when they reached it, a small detail that told Charlotte more than she wanted to admit. Honest men rarely troubled themselves to lock doors within a house full of family, even during a night as unsettled as this one. Edmund knocked firmly, and after a long pause, the door opened to reveal Gerald still dressed for the evening, though his cravat had been loosened and his composure seemed thinner than it had appeared downstairs. "Edmund," he said, glancing briefly at Charlotte before returning his attention to his cousin. "It is rather late for a visit." "We need to speak with you," Edmund said, stepping past him into the room without waiting for an invitation. Charlotte followed, taking in the chamber quickly, the open trunk near the wardrobe, the desk cluttered with papers, the general disorder of a man who had been moving quickly and carelessly through his own belongings. "Speak about what, exactly?" Gerald asked, closing the door behind them, his tone carrying the first thin edge of wariness. "The necklace has been found," Edmund said plainly, "given to a young footman, who confirms it was you who paid him to have it smuggled out through the stables tonight." Gerald's expression flickered, just for an instant, before settling back into practiced calm. "I do not know what you mean. If a footman has claimed such a thing, he is either mistaken or lying to protect himself from whatever trouble he has actually gotten into." "He described you precisely," Charlotte said. "Your coat, your voice, the exact words you used when you told him the necklace belonged to you rightfully. A misunderstanding. Nothing more," Gerald said, though his eyes moved briefly, involuntarily, toward the desk cluttered with papers behind him. Charlotte noticed the glance and stepped past him before he could stop her, reaching the desk just as he lunged to intervene. "Do not touch my correspondence," he snapped, all pretense of calm finally abandoning him. But it was too late. Charlotte had already seen enough. A half-finished letter in Gerald's own hand, its language unmistakable even in its unfinished state, referencing the necklace directly, referencing the timing of the ball, referencing a payment still owed to someone unnamed for their assistance in the evening's arrangements. She held the letter out toward Edmund, her hand steady despite the pounding of her heart. "He wrote this himself." Edmund took it, scanning the lines quickly, his expression hardening with every word. "This is enough, Gerald. More than enough." Gerald's composure finally broke entirely, the easy charm sliding away to reveal something colder and more desperate beneath it. "You do not understand what it has been like," he said, his voice rising. "Watching this family, this title, this entire estate handed to you simply because of the order in which we were born, while I have been left to manage on whatever scraps our father's old disagreements allowed me. I did not ask for any of this. I only wanted what should have rightfully come to me." "By destroying an innocent woman?" Edmund demanded, his voice low and furious now, all restraint gone. "By having her arrested, imprisoned, her name ruined beyond repair, simply to clear your own path toward something that was never yours to claim?" "I did not think it would go so far," Gerald said, though the words rang hollow even as he spoke them. "I only meant to create enough doubt, enough scandal, that you might eventually set the marriage aside. An annulment, perhaps, once suspicion had settled firmly enough upon her. I never intended for her to actually stand trial." "And yet you allowed Hensley to set a deadline for formal charges," Charlotte said, her voice trembling now not with fear but with anger, sharp and clear. "You allowed the accusation to stand exactly as it was, knowing full well what it would cost me, because it served your purpose regardless of how far it went." Gerald said nothing, his silence its own confession. A sudden commotion from the corridor outside interrupted the tense standoff, raised voices and the sound of hurried footsteps growing closer. Edmund moved quickly to the door, opening it to find Margaret Finch being half-dragged along the corridor by a man Charlotte did not immediately recognize, his grip tight around her upper arm, her face pale with fear. "Let her go," Edmund commanded, stepping into the corridor with Charlotte close behind him. The man released Margaret's arm at once, though his expression remained defensive rather than apologetic. "I found her attempting to leave the house through the servants' entrance, Your Grace, carrying a bag packed as though she meant to disappear before morning. Given tonight's circumstances, I thought it best to bring her to you directly, rather than allow her to simply vanish." Margaret stumbled forward, catching herself against the wall, tears already gathering in her eyes. "I did not mean to run, Your Grace. I only meant to protect myself. After I spoke with you earlier, someone came to my quarters and warned me that I would regret speaking further, that it would be best for everyone if I simply left the estate quietly before the night's end." "Who warned you?" Charlotte asked, moving closer, her earlier anger now tempered by genuine concern for the frightened young woman before her. "I did not see his face clearly, Your Grace. It was dark, and he kept his voice low. But he knew things only someone close to Mr. Gerald would know, details about the arrangement, about the payment promised to the footman, things I had only just learned myself when I overheard part of a conversation earlier tonight, before I ever came to speak with you." Charlotte turned back toward Gerald's open door, where he stood now flanked uneasily between Edmund's cold fury and the mounting evidence gathering steadily against him. "You sent someone to silence her." "I did no such thing," Gerald said quickly. though the denial carried little conviction now, his earlier composure entirely abandoned. "I do not know what she is speaking of." "Someone in this house is still working on your behalf," Edmund said. "Even now, even as your own letter sits in my hand as proof of everything you have done." "Who else is involved, Gerald? Because I promise you, before this night ends, I intend to know every name." Before Gerald could answer, or refuse to answer, a new voice broke into the tense silence of the corridor, calm and unexpected. "I believe I can help with that," Henry Colton said, stepping into view from the shadowed end of the hallway, his hands raised slightly to show he carried no threat, though his sudden appearance sent a fresh jolt of alarm through Charlotte regardless. "You," Edmund said, his voice sharpening further, suspicion evident in every syllable. "I was told you arrived uninvited tonight." "I did," Henry admitted, "though not for the reasons you likely suspect. I came because Gerald approached me nearly a fortnight ago, aware of my old history with the Duchess, and offered payment in exchange for creating a distraction tonight, drawing attention toward myself and away from whatever he intended to arrange. I did not know the full details of his plan. I agreed foolishly, out of old bitterness I am not proud of, believing it to be nothing more than harmless mischief meant to embarrass the household slightly. I did not know it would involve theft, or a false accusation serious enough to threaten someone's freedom." Charlotte studied him carefully, searching for deception in his expression, and finding instead something closer to genuine shame. "Why come forward now?" "Because I watched you tonight," Henry said quietly, "carrying yourself with more composure than I have shown throughout this entire wretched affair, and I realized I could not allow old resentment to cost you your reputation, whatever grievances I once believed I held against you. I am not proud of the part I played, small as it was, but I will not compound that mistake by staying silent while you take the full weight of blame that belongs to someone else entirely." Gerald's face had gone pale, watching his own carefully constructed scheme unravel piece by piece in front of him, each new voice adding another layer of evidence he could no longer hope to explain away. Edmund turned to Margaret, still trembling slightly against the corridor wall. "Can you identify the man who threatened you, if you see him again?" "I believe so, Your Grace. His voice, at least. I would know it if I heard it spoken again clearly." "Then we will find him," Edmund said, "before dawn arrives. Gerald, you will remain in this chamber under watch until Hensley can be brought to hear all of this directly. I will not have you disappearing into the night as your accomplice nearly convinced Margaret to do." Gerald opened his mouth as though to protest, then seemed to think better of it, sinking instead into the chair beside his cluttered desk, all defiance finally drained from him, replaced by the hollow resignation of a man who understood, at last, that his careful plan had collapsed entirely under its own weight. Charlotte stepped back into the corridor, drawing a steadying breath, aware that the night was far from finished even now. Somewhere within this house, an unnamed accomplice still moved freely, someone willing to threaten a frightened maid into silence, someone who had not yet been exposed to the growing weight of evidence closing in around Gerald's failed scheme. Edmund posted a steward outside Gerald's door with firm instructions to allow no one in or out, then turned his attention to the question that mattered most now. "Margaret, think carefully. Was there anything else about the man who threatened you? Anything at all? Even something that seemed unimportant at the time?" Margaret pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself enough to remember clearly. "He wore gloves, Your Grace, even indoors, which struck me as odd at the time, though I did not think much of it in my fear. And there was a smell about him, something sharp, like the polish used on fine boots. I noticed it because it reminded me of the boot room near the stables." "The stables again," Charlotte said, exchanging a glance with Edmund. "Whoever this is moves easily between the house and the grounds. A groom, perhaps, or someone who works closely enough with the horses to carry that smell without thinking of it. There is a young groom who arrived with Gerald's own carriage," Edmund said slowly, memory sharpening as he spoke. "I noticed him only briefly earlier tonight, unloading trunks near the stable entrance. I did not think to question his presence at the time." They moved quickly toward the rear of the house, down through the servants' passages and out into the cool night air, the stables visible ahead beneath a thin scattering of stars now beginning to fade toward the coming dawn. A lantern burned low near the stable entrance, and beside it, a young man in a groom's coat stood arguing in hushed, urgent tones with someone Charlotte could not immediately see. "Wait," Edmund murmured, catching her arm and drawing her back into the shadow of the garden wall. They watched as the groom passed a small leather pouch to the second figure, who counted its contents quickly before slipping away toward the road beyond the estate gates. "That is the payment," Charlotte whispered, "for tonight's silence. or perhaps for services already rendered. Edmund stepped forward before the groom could retreat fully into the stable, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "You will not be riding anywhere tonight." The groom startled violently, spinning to face them, and for a moment, Charlotte thought he might bolt for the darkness beyond the lantern light. Instead, seeing the Duke himself standing before him, all defiance seemed to drain from his young face at once. "Your Grace, I only did as I was instructed," he said quickly, words tumbling over one another in his haste to explain. "Mr. Gerald's man told me to deliver a message to the lady's maid, nothing more, and to make certain she understood the seriousness of staying silent tonight. I did not touch her, I swear it. I only spoke the words I was given." "Whose words?" Edmund demanded. The groom hesitated, glancing once more toward the road where the second figure had already disappeared into darkness, then seemed to decide that loyalty to a scheme already unraveling was no longer worth whatever protection it once promised. "Mr. Gerald's valet, Your Grace. He has been carrying messages back and forth all evening, arranging payments, making certain everything moved according to plan. I only carried out what he asked of me. I swear I did not know the full purpose behind any of it." Charlotte felt the last threads of the night's mystery drawing tight at last, each name leading naturally to the next, a chain of small complicities that had nearly succeeded in destroying her entirely. "The valet who asked Margaret which chamber held my evening gown," she said. "The same man arranging tonight's escape. Bring him to me," Edmund said to the groom, his voice leaving no room for further hesitation. "Now, before he has any further chance to disappear. We are close," she said quietly to Edmund. "Closer than we have been all night, but we are not finished yet." "No," Edmund agreed, glancing once more toward Gerald's slumped, defeated figure before turning back toward the corridor stretching ahead of them, toward whatever remained hidden still within the walls of his own house. "Not yet, but dawn is coming quickly now, and I do not intend to let it arrive before we have every answer we came for." The groom hurried off toward the servants' quarters to find the valet, and Charlotte stood for a moment in the cooling night air, looking out toward the horizon where the faintest hint of gray had begun to soften the darkness along the tree line. There was not much time left. Whatever remained to be uncovered would need to come quickly now, before the household woke fully to a new day and Hensley returned expecting either a name or a formal charge against her. "Come," Edmund said gently, offering his hand to guide her back toward the house. "One more piece remains, and then this will finally be over." Charlotte took his hand, grateful for its steadiness, and together they turned back toward the house, toward whatever final truth still waited to be dragged into the light before the sun rose over the estate and decided, once and for all, whose word would be believed. The valet, a lean man named Walter Price, was found within the quarter hour, discovered attempting to slip quietly out through a side door near the kitchens with a small bag already packed. He did not resist when the groom brought him before Edmund, his shoulders sagging with the particular resignation of a man who understood that whatever careful arrangement he had served was already beyond saving. "You need not say anything," Edmund told him. Once they had gathered again in the drawing room, Charlotte seated close beside her husband, Gerald brought down under guard from his chamber to sit stiffly near the fireplace, his earlier bravado entirely extinguished. "I have your master's own letter, a footman who confirms the necklace was passed to him directly, a groom who admits to carrying threats on your instruction, and a lady's maid frightened badly enough to nearly flee this house entirely because of you. Whatever loyalty you believe you owe Gerald, it will not save either of you now. The only question remaining is whether you wish to speak the full truth yourself, or wait for us to piece it together regardless, one witness at a time, until nothing remains hidden." Walter's eyes flicked toward Gerald, seeking some final instruction, some last gesture of the authority he had served so faithfully throughout the evening. Gerald said nothing, staring instead into the low fire, his silence itself an answer. "He offered to clear my debts," Walter said finally, the words coming slowly at first, then faster, as though a great weight were finally being set down after being carried too long. "I owed money to men who do not forgive debts easily, Your Grace. Mr. Gerald learned of it somehow, months ago, and offered to settle everything in exchange for my help arranging tonight's events. I did not ask too many questions. I did not ask too many questions. I did not ask too many questions. What exactly did you do?" Edmund asked. "I cut the piece of silk from the Duchess's gown while it sat in the servants' hall, and left it near the window latch myself, after the necklace had already been removed from its case. I delivered the false message to Grady's name, knowing the Duchess trusted him enough not to question it. I arranged for Hensley to be summoned early, before the theft was even properly discovered, so that suspicion would fall immediately and formally rather than allowing time for quiet resolution. And tonight, when Margaret came dangerously close to revealing what she suspected. I sent the groom to frighten her into silence, believing it would be enough to keep her quiet until morning. Charlotte listened to the confession with a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest, hearing at last the full mechanism of the trap that had so nearly destroyed her, laid out plainly by the very hand that had built it. Each piece she and Edmund had uncovered through the long night now slotted into place with terrible clarity. The false message, the cut silk, the hidden passage, the necklace passed hand to hand through frightened servants who had understood only fragments of the larger design controlling them. "How long had you been planning this?" she asked Walter directly, needing to understand the full shape of the danger that had nearly consumed her. "Weeks, Your Grace," Walter admitted. Mr. Gerald spoke of it carefully at first, testing how far I might be willing to go before he revealed the full extent of what he intended. By the time I understood the entire plan, I felt too deeply involved already to refuse him, and too afraid of what exposure might cost me, both with my creditors and with the law itself, given how much I had already agreed to do on his behalf. "You could have come to me," Edmund said, his voice carrying more disappointment now than anger. "Whatever debt burdened you, it might have been settled honestly, without dragging an innocent woman through public disgrace to purchase your own relief." Walter lowered his eyes, unable to meet his employer's gaze. "I know that now, Your Grace. I did not allow myself to consider it clearly at the time. Fear has a way of narrowing a man's thinking, until only the nearest danger seems to matter, and I let that fear carry me further than I ever should have gone." Charlotte studied him, torn between the anger she still carried for the role he had played and a reluctant, uncomfortable understanding of how easily desperation might lead an ordinary man toward choices he would never otherwise have made. It did not excuse what he had done, it only explained it, and explanation, she thought, was a poor substitute for the harm already caused. Gerald stirred slightly in his chair by the fire, drawing every eye in the room toward him once more. "None of what he says changes anything I bear responsibility for," he said quietly, surprising Charlotte with the sudden, flat honesty of it. "I sought him out. I offered the payment. Whatever fear guided his choices, mine were made freely, with full understanding of what I asked him to do." It was the closest thing to genuine remorse Gerald had shown throughout the entire ordeal, and Charlotte found herself uncertain what to make of it, whether it reflected real conscience finally surfacing beneath his earlier desperation, or simply the practical recognition that further denial would serve him nothing, now that the truth stood so plainly exposed before them all. "And the necklace itself," Edmund said. "Where was it kept between the moment it was taken and the moment it was given to the footman?" "Hidden within the walls, Your Grace, in the old passage behind the dressing chamber. Mr. Gerald knew of its existence from childhood visits to the estate, long before either of us imagined tonight's events. He retrieved it himself once the ball's confusion made it safe to move unnoticed, then arranged for it to be smuggled away entirely, removing the last piece of evidence that might have proven the Duchess's innocence." Gerald finally spoke, his voice flat and drained of its earlier confidence. "I never intended real harm to come to her. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that the scandal alone would be enough, that Edmund would quietly set the marriage aside once suspicion settled and the household's reputation seemed at risk, and that in time, without an heir produced, the estate would eventually pass where I have always believed it rightfully belonged." "You believed wrong," Edmund said, his voice cold and final, "on every count." "Who was the man at the stables?" Edmund asked Walter directly. "The one who took payment from the groom and vanished down the north road. I want his name before we go any further." Walter hesitated, glancing nervously toward the shuttered window as though the man himself might somehow be listening from outside. "His name is Ferris, Your Grace, a hired man, not part of this household. Mr. Gerald engaged him some weeks ago, in case matters required a firmer hand than persuasion alone could provide. I do not know where he lodges, only that he was to wait near the north road until the necklace reached him, then disappear entirely once his part was finished." "He has already been paid," Charlotte said slowly, a fresh unease settling over her. "Which means he no longer has any reason to stay quiet, or any reason to fear consequence for whatever else he might still be willing to do before he vanishes for good." As if summoned by the very mention of his name, a sharp crash sounded from the corridor outside, glass shattering against stone, followed immediately by a startled cry from one of the household staff. Edmund moved toward the door at once, Charlotte close behind him despite his sharp warning to stay back, and threw it open to find a narrow side window broken inward, cold night air pouring through the jagged opening, and a gloved hand already withdrawing from where it had reached through to fumble at the corridor's inner latch. "Ferris," Walter breathed from behind them, his face draining of what little color remained in it. He must have learned Gerald was caught. He would not leave loose ends behind, not when his own name might still be spoken aloud to Hensley. Edmund did not hesitate. He seized the fire iron resting beside the corridor's small hearth and moved toward the broken window. But by the time he reached it, the intruder had already withdrawn into the darkness of the garden beyond, footsteps fading rapidly across the gravel path. A steward came running at the commotion, and Edmund directed him quickly to rouse 2 more men and search the grounds, though something in his tightened jaw told Charlotte he did not expect them to find anyone still lingering nearby. He came for Walter, Charlotte said quietly, once the immediate danger had passed and the household had begun settling back into uneasy watchfulness. To silence him before he could speak further, exactly as he tried to silence Margaret. Or he came for the letter, Edmund said grimly, patting the fold of his coat where Gerald's confession still rested safely, knowing it was the one piece of proof strong enough to end this, beyond any possible denial. Either way, we cannot afford to linger here any longer than necessary. Every minute we remain gives him further opportunity to try again, or to disappear entirely before Hensley can be told his name. Margaret, still pale from her own earlier fright, reached for Charlotte's hand and held it tightly. "Please, Your Grace, let us go now, together. I do not wish to remain in this house a moment longer than we must, not until every one of them has been properly dealt with." Charlotte squeezed her hand in return, grateful for the small, steadying warmth of it. "We will go together, all of us. Hensley will have his answer, and this house will finally be rid of every shadow that has haunted it tonight." Edmund moved quickly, gathering the small group toward the front hall, sparing only a moment to confirm that Gerald remained securely under guard, his earlier defiance having drained entirely away into something closer to numb resignation. The broken window behind them was left for the household staff to address once daylight arrived properly, a small, jagged reminder of how close danger had come even in these final hours. Charlotte moved to the window and drew back the heavy curtain slightly, and there, unmistakably, the black of the night sky had begun softening at its edges, the faintest gray creeping upward from the horizon like water seeping slowly through cloth. "Dawn," she said quietly. "Hensley will be waiting for his answer." Edmund folded the confession letter carefully and tucked it inside his coat. "Then we will not keep him waiting a moment longer than necessary. Bring Walter. Gerald will come as well, whether he wishes to or not." Gerald rose slowly from his chair, his earlier composure entirely gone now, replaced by the hollow stillness of a man who understood that whatever remained of the night belonged no longer to his careful planning, but to the consequences he had never truly believed would arrive. Charlotte watched him for a long moment, feeling neither triumph nor pity settle cleanly in its place, only a tired, aching clarity that the truth, however painful to reach, had finally been dragged fully into the light. "We must move quickly," Edmund said, glancing once more toward the brightening window. "Hensley made his deadline plain. I do not intend to test whether he holds to it strictly, not when we finally have everything needed to end this properly." They gathered Walter and the still trembling groom, and with Margaret walking close beside Charlotte for support, the small procession made its way from the drawing room toward the front hall, where guests who had lingered through the long night now stood in scattered, curious clusters, drawn by the unmistakable sense that something significant was unfolding before them at last. Charlotte kept her chin lifted as they crossed the hall, aware of every eye following their progress, aware too, for the first time since the accusation had first been spoken aloud, that she no longer needed to fear what those watching eyes might conclude. The proof she needed walked beside her now, plain and undeniable, carried in Gerald's own defeated silence, and in the folded letter resting against Edmund's chest. Outside, the sky had lightened further still, the stars fading one by one, as the estate's long drive stretched pale and empty toward the gates, where Hensley's carriage waited, its lamps still burning faintly against the thinning dark. "He is there," Charlotte said, spotting the magistrate's tall figure standing beside the carriage, arms folded, watching their approach with an expression she could not yet fully read. "Then let us finish this," Edmund said, "before the sun rises fully and decides the matter without us." They quickened their pace together across the gravel drive, the small procession of witnesses and confessed conspirators trailing behind them, and Charlotte felt her heart pounding steadily against her ribs, not with the fear that had gripped her at the start of this long night, but with something closer to fierce, determined hope, the sense that after everything endured since the moment her scream first shattered the music of the ball, the truth was finally, at last, only a few short steps away. Halfway across the drive, a movement near the tree line beyond the gates caught Charlotte's eye, a shape too deliberate to be simply a branch stirred by the early morning breeze. She slowed, uncertain, and beside her Edmund's hand tightened briefly around hers, a silent acknowledgement that he had seen it too. "Keep walking," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "Do not give him reason to think we have noticed." They continued forward at the same steady pace, though every step now carried the sharp, watchful tension of two people aware that danger had not yet fully retreated from this long night, only withdrawn far enough to wait for another opportunity. Two of the estate's stewards had fallen into step near the rear of their small procession, summoned quietly by Edmund before they left the house, and Charlotte took some comfort in knowing they were not entirely without protection should Ferris choose this final stretch of open ground to make some last, desperate attempt. The shape near the tree line did not move again, and by the time they reached the gates, Charlotte allowed herself to believe it had been nothing more than a startled deer, or perhaps her own overwrought imagination finding threats in shadows that held none. Still, she did not fully release the breath she had been holding until Hensley's carriage stood close before them, its lamps casting a steady, reassuring glow across the gravel, and the magistrate himself stepped forward to meet them with an expression that had already begun shifting from weary impatience into something more attentive. "Your Grace," Hensley said, addressing Edmund first, his eyes moving quickly over the unusual procession trailing behind him, Gerald pale and silent, Walter refusing to meet anyone's gaze, Margaret and the young groom standing close together for mutual courage. "I confess I did not expect quite so large a delegation at this hour." "You asked for an answer by dawn," Edmund said, drawing the folded letter from his coat and holding it out steadily. "I have brought you rather more than that." Hensley took the letter but did not open it immediately, his gaze instead moving slowly across each face gathered before him, weighing the weight of what such a delegation implied before he had read a single word. Behind them, the sky had brightened further still, the last stars fading entirely now against a pale wash of early morning light spreading steadily above the tree line. "Tell me plainly," Hensley said, "before I read a single line, is the Duchess innocent?" "Entirely," Edmund said, without a moment's hesitation. "And I can prove it beyond any reasonable doubt you might still hold." Charlotte stood very still beside her husband, watching the magistrate's face for any sign of what judgment might follow, aware that despite everything gathered and confessed through this long, exhausting night, the final word still rested in hands other than her own. She had fought for this moment since the instant her scream first broke the music of the ball, had chased threads of proof through hidden passages and frightened confessions, had faced danger twice over before the sun had even fully risen, and now, standing at the very edge of vindication, she found she could do nothing more than wait, breath held, for Hensley to finally speak. He unfolded the letter slowly and began, at last, to read. Hensley read slowly, his eyes moving line by line across Gerald's own confession, and Charlotte watched his expression shift with every passing sentence, skepticism giving way gradually to something closer to grim, settled certainty. When he finally lowered the letter, the morning light had grown strong enough to catch the fine lines of concern etched across his face. "This is written in your own hand," Hensley said, turning toward Gerald directly. "You do not deny it." Gerald did not lift his eyes from the gravel beneath his feet. "I do not deny it." Hensley folded the letter carefully and looked toward Charlotte for the first time since their arrival at the gates, and something in his expression softened, the careful authority of a magistrate giving way, briefly, to something more human. "Your Grace, I owe you an apology. I acted on evidence that seemed sound at the time, and I see now how thoroughly it was constructed to mislead exactly the conclusion I drew from it. I am sorry for the distress this night has caused you." "You were doing your duty," Charlotte said, surprised to find she meant it, the anger she had carried toward him through the long night easing now that the truth stood so plainly between them. "I do not fault you for believing evidence that was deliberately built to deceive. I fault only the man who built it." Hensley turned back to Gerald, his voice hardening once more into the formal cadence of his office. "Gerald Ashworth, you stand accused, by your own written confession and by the testimony of multiple witnesses, of theft, of the deliberate framing of an innocent woman, and of coercing members of this household into criminal conduct on your behalf. I am placing you under formal arrest, to be held until proper proceedings can determine the full weight of your punishment." Gerald said nothing as two of Hensley's men stepped forward to take him into custody, his silence carrying more weight than any protest might have managed. Walter was taken as well, though Hensley noted, not unkindly, that his willingness to confess fully and without further resistance would likely be considered when his own judgment came. And Henry Colton? Edmund asked, gesturing toward where Henry stood at the edge of the gathered group, having followed quietly behind them from the house, his expression carrying the particular discomfort of a man awaiting judgment he knew he had partly earned. I came forward on my own, Henry said before Hensley could answer, stepping closer. I understand that does not erase what I agreed to do, however small my part in it truly was. I am prepared to answer for it honestly, whatever consequence that requires. Hensley studied him for a long moment. Your willingness to speak plainly, and the limited nature of your involvement, will be weighed fairly. I cannot promise you will escape consequence entirely, but I can promise it will be measured against the far greater harm intended by others in this matter. As the small procession of guards led Gerald and Walter toward a second carriage waiting further down the drive, the household staff and remaining guests who had gathered at a cautious distance began to murmur among themselves, the news of the night's true events spreading quickly from one small cluster to the next. Charlotte felt the shift in the air around her almost immediately. The same guests who had regarded her with cold suspicion only hours earlier, now watching with something closer to sympathy, even admiration, as the full shape of what she had endured became known. An elderly woman Charlotte recognized as a longtime friend of Edmund's mother approached first, taking Charlotte's hands in her own weathered ones. My dear, what a dreadful ordeal. You conducted yourself with such composure through it all. I confess I did not expect such steadiness from someone so newly married into this family. Thank you, Charlotte said, accepting the woman's warmth with a small, tired smile, though she found herself still somewhat unsteady beneath the sudden reversal of opinion. The same crowd that had so readily believed the worst of her, now just as readily embracing her vindication. More guests followed, offering their own quiet apologies or simple expressions of relief, and though Charlotte accepted each with as much grace as she could summon, she found her attention drawn again and again back toward Edmund, standing steady beside her through every exchange, his presence a quiet anchor against the whirl of attention now surrounding them both. Among the last to approach was Lady Beatrice Winslow, a sharp-tongued woman who had been among the loudest voices whispering accusation in the hours after the necklace first went missing, her comments overheard more than once by servants who had, in turn, repeated them throughout the house. She approached now with visible reluctance, her usual confidence noticeably diminished. Your Grace, she said stiffly, I understand I spoke rather freely last night, before the full truth had come to light. I hope you will not hold my hasty words against me too severely. Charlotte studied her for a moment, remembering clearly the particular cruelty of some of those hasty words as they had reached her through the long, difficult hours of the night. She might have allowed herself the satisfaction of a cold response, of making the woman feel even a fraction of the fear and humiliation she herself had endured. Instead, she found the impulse fading quickly, replaced by something closer to weary grace. We were all deceived by evidence built carefully to mislead, Charlotte said. I do not think less of anyone for believing what appeared, at the time, to be plain and undeniable. I only ask that going forward, judgment be reserved until the full truth is known, whatever the circumstances. Lady Winslow's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something like genuine respect. That is more grace than I likely deserve, Your Grace, but I thank you for it regardless. She curtsied and withdrew, leaving Charlotte and Edmund alone once more amid the thinning crowd. You were kinder to her than I might have managed, Edmund said quietly, once she had gone. I considered being otherwise, Charlotte admitted. But I found I did not want to begin this new chapter of my life carrying bitterness toward everyone who doubted me in a single desperate night. There will be enough difficulty ahead without adding grudges to the weight of it. Edmund studied her with open admiration. That is, I think, precisely the kind of judgment I hope you will continue sharing with me, now that we have learned to work as true partners rather than polite strangers. It was nearly an hour before the last of the guests had offered their peace and departed toward their carriages, the estate slowly emptying of the crowd that had filled it so completely only the night before. Margaret and the young footman were given leave to rest, their part in the night's events finally concluded, and the household staff began the quiet work of restoring order to a house that had weathered a storm, few of them fully understood even now. Charlotte found herself, at last, standing alone with Edmund in the gardens behind the house, the morning sun now fully risen and casting warm, golden light across dew still clinging to the grass. The events of the night felt distant already, strange and unreal, as though they belonged to someone else's memory rather than her own. I keep thinking of the moment I first saw the empty case, she said quietly. I did not believe, in that instant, that anything could set it right again. I thought my name was already ruined beyond repair, whatever the truth eventually proved to be. I understand, Edmund said. I felt something similar, watching Hensley's certainty as he spoke of formal charges. It seemed, for a moment, that the truth might not matter at all against the weight of appearances already stacked against you. But it did matter, Charlotte said. In the end, it was the only thing that mattered. Edmund turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a warmth she had rarely seen from him in the 8 months of their careful, arranged companionship. I think I understood something else tonight as well, watching you refuse to simply wait for others to decide your fate. You did not sit quietly in that chamber hoping I would somehow save you. You fought for your own truth as fiercely as I did, perhaps more so, and I find I admire that more than I know how to properly say. Charlotte felt warmth rise in her cheeks, unfamiliar and welcome after the long night's cold fear. We fought for it together, she said. I do not think either of us could have uncovered the truth alone. It took both of us, working as partners rather than strangers sharing a title. Partners, Edmund repeated, as though testing the word's weight for the first time. I think I should like that, if you are willing. I am, Charlotte said, and found she meant it fully, without hesitation or reservation, in a way she had not expected to feel toward the arranged stranger she had married 8 months earlier. She thought back, briefly, to the early days of their marriage, the careful formality that had governed nearly every exchange between them, the polite distance neither had quite known how to close. She had assumed, in those first weeks, that such distance was simply the nature of arranged unions, that warmth and understanding, if they came at all, would arrive slowly over years, rather than being forged suddenly in the crucible of a single desperate night. I did not expect this, she admitted, any of it. Not the accusation, and certainly not this, standing here now, feeling as though I finally know the man I married. Nor did I, Edmund said. I confess I approached our marriage the way I approached most matters of estate and duty, as an arrangement to be managed properly, rather than a partnership to be built. I regret that now, seeing how much I might have learned about you sooner, had I only taken the time to ask. You are asking now, Charlotte said gently. Then let me begin properly, Edmund said, a faint smile touching his features for the first time since the long night had begun. Tell me something true about yourself, Charlotte, something I would not have learned simply by reading a ledger of your family's holdings or listening to the careful arrangements our fathers negotiated between them. Charlotte considered the question seriously, surprised by how much she wanted to answer it honestly. I was terrified of large gatherings as a girl, she said. I used to hide in the library during my mother's dinner parties, certain I would say something foolish if forced to make conversation with strangers. It took years before I learned to mask that fear well enough to move through society as though it came naturally to me. And last night, Edmund said, surrounded by a crowd ready to condemn you, accused publicly of a crime you did not commit, you did not hide at all. You faced it directly, every step of the way. I did not have the luxury of hiding, Charlotte said, but I think, even if I had, I would have chosen to face it regardless. Some fears, I have learned, are worth standing against directly, whatever the cost of doing so. Edmund reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with a gentleness that felt entirely new between them. I am grateful, more than I know how to properly express, that you chose to stand and fight rather than simply accept whatever fate others tried to assign you. They stood together in the quiet garden as the household slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms around them, servants moving between the house and the stables, the broken window from the night before already being measured for repair, the estate settling gradually back into the calm it had known before the ball's chaos disrupted everything. Charlotte thought of Gerald, now facing whatever consequence awaited him, his bitterness having cost him everything he had hoped to gain, and more besides. She thought of Walter, whose fear and desperation had led him down a path he might never have chosen under different circumstances. She thought of Henry, carrying his own smaller guilt honestly forward into whatever judgment awaited him. And she thought of herself, standing now in this garden beside a husband who had chosen, at every turn through the long night, to believe in her rather than the evidence stacked so carefully against her. What happens now, she asked. Beyond today, I mean. Beyond the formal proceedings and the gossip that will surely follow this for weeks to come. Edmund considered the question seriously, as though it deserved the same careful attention he had given every piece of evidence through the long night. I think, perhaps, we begin properly what we only started by arrangement 8 months ago. I have spent this night learning more about my own wife than I managed to learn in all the months before it combined. I find I would like to continue learning, if you will allow it. Charlotte smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile she had offered since long before the ball had even begun. I think I would like that as well. The sun climbed higher above the estate, burning away the last traces of morning mist from the gardens, and Charlotte felt, standing there beside Edmund with the danger of the night finally, fully behind her, that something new had begun to take root between them, something built not on arrangement or obligation, but on the hard-won trust of two people who had faced a crisis together and emerged from it, at last, as true partners. Word of the night's events spread through the wider society in the days that followed, carried from household to household with the particular speed such scandals always seem to travel. But this time, the story that spread was not one of a disgraced duchess accused of theft, but of a woman who had faced false accusation with remarkable composure, who had fought alongside her husband to uncover a conspiracy built against her, and who had emerged from the ordeal not diminished but strengthened, her reputation not merely restored but elevated, among those who had once been so quick to doubt her. Charlotte found, in the weeks that followed, that the careful distance which had once defined her marriage had given way entirely to something warmer, a partnership built through shared danger and mutual trust rather than the cold practicality of arrangement alone. Edmund sought her counsel now on matters both large and small, valuing her judgment in a way he had never fully done before the night the necklace disappeared, and Charlotte found herself, in turn, trusting him with an openness she had not believed herself capable of when their marriage first began. The estate itself slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms, the broken window repaired, the hidden passage sealed properly for the first time in generations, and the memory of that long, dangerous night gradually settling into the kind of story told quietly by the fireside, a testament to how quickly appearances could deceive, and how much could be uncovered by two people willing to seek the truth together, rather than accept the easy conclusion offered to them. Charlotte often thought back in quiet moments to the instant her scream had first shattered the music of the ball, and to how impossible it had seemed then that anything could set right what had broken in that moment. But dawn had come, as it always did, carrying with it not the ruin she had feared, but a truth strong enough to outweigh every careful lie built against her, and a partnership forged in the fire of that single, desperate night, strong enough to carry them both forward into whatever came next. Some evenings, when the household had quieted and the estate lay peaceful beneath the stars, Charlotte and Edmund would walk together through the same gardens where they had first spoken so openly to one another, and she would find herself grateful, in a way she had not expected to feel toward the circumstances of that terrible night, for everything it had ultimately given them. A marriage that had begun as a careful arrangement between two families had become, through crisis and trust and the shared work of uncovering a difficult truth, something far more enduring than either of them had once believed possible. And whatever challenges still lay ahead, Charlotte faced them now not as a stranger sharing a household by obligation, but as a true partner, standing firmly beside the man she had come, at last, to fully trust. 3 months passed before the formal proceedings against Gerald Ashworth finally concluded, months during which Charlotte watched her husband carry the weight of his cousin's betrayal with a quiet, steady dignity that only deepened her respect for him. The trial itself drew considerable attention throughout society, curious onlookers filling the gallery each day to hear testimony that confirmed, piece by piece, everything Charlotte and Edmund had uncovered during that single desperate night. Walter's cooperation throughout the proceedings earned him a measure of leniency, his sentence reduced in recognition of his full and early confession, though he would spend a considerable time in confinement regardless, his debts settled instead through forfeiture of whatever wages remained owed to him. Charlotte found she could not entirely hate him, even now, understanding as she did the desperate fear that had driven his choices, though she remained firm in her belief that fear alone could never fully excuse the harm he had caused. Gerald received the harsher judgment his actions warranted, stripped of whatever claim he might once have held to family favor or future inheritance, his name quietly removed from consideration in any matter concerning the estate's succession. He did not speak to Edmund again throughout the proceedings, his earlier bitterness having curdled into something closer to silent shame, and Charlotte found herself, in the end, feeling less anger toward him than a kind of distant sorrow for all he had thrown away, in pursuit of something that had never truly belonged to him. Henry Colton's judgment proved lighter, as Hensley had predicted, his willingness to come forward and the limited nature of his involvement earning him a formal reprimand rather than harsher punishment. He called on Charlotte and Edmund once more before departing the county entirely. A quiet visit meant more as apology than any expectation of forgiveness. "I do not ask you to think well of me," he said, standing rather stiffly in the drawing room where the whole affair had first been unraveled through Walter's confession. "I only wish to say, before I leave, that I am sorry for the part I played, however small, and that I hope you will find nothing but happiness ahead of you, Your Grace." whatever bitterness once stood between us. "Thank you, Henry," Charlotte said, and found she meant the words sincerely. "I hope you find your own peace as well, wherever you settle next." He nodded, bowed properly to them both, and left the estate for the final time, and Charlotte felt, watching him go, that one more thread of the long night's difficult tangle had finally been resolved and set aside. With the formal proceedings concluded, life at the estate settled gradually into new rhythms, though Charlotte noticed the change was not simply a return to how things had been before the ball, but the emergence of something genuinely different. Edmund sought her opinion now on matters of the household and the estate's management with a regularity that would have seemed unthinkable in the earlier, more distant months of their marriage. She found herself walking beside him through the fields and tenant farms that made up the bulk of the estate's income, listening as he explained the finer details of crop rotation and tenant agreements, offering her own observations when she noticed something he had overlooked. "You have a sharper eye for these matters than I expected," Edmund told her one afternoon, as they walked back from a visit to one of the tenant farms, where a dispute over shared grazing land had required careful diplomatic resolution. "I spent a great deal of my childhood accompanying my father on similar visits," Charlotte admitted. "I do not think he ever intended to teach me anything useful, only to keep me occupied while he conducted his business, but I suppose some of it took root regardless." "I am glad it did," Edmund said. "This estate will be better managed for having two careful minds attending to it rather than one." Word of their strengthened marriage spread slowly through society, alongside the memory of the scandal that had nearly destroyed it, and Charlotte found herself regarded now with a curious mixture of sympathy and admiration wherever she went. Guests eager to hear her account of that long, dangerous night, directly from her own lips, rather than through the increasingly exaggerated retellings that had circulated in the months since. She learned, over time, to tell the story with a measure of grace rather than bitterness, focusing less on the fear she had endured and more on the partnership that had ultimately emerged from it, though she never fully lost the small, cold echo of that first scream whenever she happened to pass the dressing chamber where it had all begun. The hidden passage behind the paneling had been sealed permanently, bricked over entirely at Edmund's insistence, a quiet, physical acknowledgement that whatever secrets the old house had once concealed within its walls would trouble them no further. Margaret remained in Charlotte's service, her earlier fear gradually giving way to renewed confidence as the months passed, and Charlotte made certain she understood how deeply her honesty that night had mattered, how easily the outcome might have been different had she chosen silence instead of the frightening courage it took to come forward. "You saved me as much as Edmund did," Charlotte told her once, during a quiet afternoon spent together mending linens in the sitting room. "I do not think I have properly thanked you for that." Margaret flushed slightly at the praise. "I only told the truth, Your Grace. It seemed a small thing to offer, given everything you faced that night." "It was not a small thing," Charlotte said firmly. Speaking honestly when silence would have been so much easier rarely is. Late one evening, several weeks after Gerald's trial had concluded, a letter arrived at the estate bearing news that gave Charlotte pause, word from a distant cousin of Gerald's own mother, expressing quiet dismay at the family's disgrace, and asking, cautiously, whether any reconciliation might eventually be possible once Gerald had served his sentence in full. Charlotte brought the letter to Edmund that night, uncertain how he might receive it. Edmund read it slowly, his expression difficult to read, and set it down on the desk between them, with a long, considering breath. "I do not know that I am ready to forgive him," he admitted. "Perhaps I never will be fully. What he did to you, to this household, cannot simply be forgotten because enough time has passed." "I do not ask you to forgive him," Charlotte said gently. "I only wanted you to see the letter, and to decide for yourself what response, if any, feels right to you." "What would you have me do?" Edmund asked, studying her carefully. Charlotte considered the question honestly before answering. "I think in time, some door should remain open, however small. Not because he deserves easy forgiveness, but because closing every door entirely tends to harden bitterness rather than resolve it, and I do not wish bitterness to be the legacy this family carries forward from what happened. But that choice belongs to you as much as to me, perhaps more so, given the blood between you." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, turning the letter over in his hands. "Perhaps, someday, once enough time has passed and enough has been properly answered for, I might find room for a measured correspondence. Nothing more than that, not yet, but I will consider it, rather than dismissing it outright." Charlotte nodded, satisfied with the honesty of his answer, and let the matter rest there, understanding that some wounds required more time to heal than others, and that patience, more than forced reconciliation, would serve her husband best in working through the particular grief of a family betrayal. The estate's ordinary business continued alongside these quieter, more personal reckonings. Harvest season arrived with its usual demands, and Charlotte found herself increasingly involved in decisions she once would have left entirely to Edmund's judgment, reviewing accounts alongside him in the evenings, offering suggestions on which tenant requests deserved priority, learning the particular rhythms of an estate she had once regarded as simply the setting for her arranged marriage, rather than a living, breathing responsibility she now felt genuinely invested in maintaining well. Word came, too, of Margaret's quiet courtship with one of the estate's younger stewards, a development that brought Charlotte genuine happiness to witness. Watching the young woman who had once trembled with fear in a darkened corridor, now laughing freely in the estate's sunlit gardens, her earlier ordeal gradually fading into distant memory, rather than lingering shadow. As the first anniversary of their marriage approached, now only a few months distant from the anniversary of that terrible, transformative night, Edmund surprised Charlotte with a small, private dinner in the same garden where they had first spoken so openly to one another in the pale light of that early dawn. Lanterns hung from the surrounding trees, their warm glow reflecting softly against the same stone terrace where Charlotte had once stood watching the sky brighten with fear rather than hope. "I wanted to mark the occasion properly," Edmund said, as they settled at the small table arranged beneath the lanterns, "not the anniversary of our arranged marriage alone, but everything that has grown from it since. I do not think I fully understood, when we first exchanged our vows, what kind of partnership I might eventually find with you." Charlotte reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Nor did I. I think, if someone had told me on our wedding day that it would take a stolen necklace and a night of genuine danger to teach us how to truly trust one another, I would have found the notion absurd." "And yet here we are," Edmund said, smiling in the soft lantern light. "Here we are," Charlotte agreed, grateful, strangely enough, for a night neither of us would ever wish to relive, and for everything it ultimately taught us about each other. They sat together long into the evening, the estate quiet and peaceful around them. The danger and fear of that long night now settled fully into memory rather than present threat. Charlotte thought, watching the lantern light flicker gently against her husband's face, that whatever challenges still lay ahead for them, whatever difficulties an estate and a title and a shared future might yet bring, they would face them now as they had faced that desperate night, together, as true partners bound not merely by arrangement, but by the hard-won trust only genuine crisis could have taught them to build. The stars emerged slowly above the garden as the evening deepened, and somewhere beyond the estate's walls, the world continued its ordinary turning, unaware of how close one household had come to tragedy, and how completely it had instead found something lasting and true. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the quiet peace of the moment, and understood, with a certainty she had never fully possessed before that long night began, that whatever came next, she would not face it alone.